everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's Amber and today's video is going to be my best books of 2024. So far this year I've reached my Goodreads goal, actually just this morning, of reading 50 books. I'll probably manage to maybe get another 2 in before the actual end of the year, but as it stands at the moment, these are my 10 favourite books of the year. I feel like I'm going to be really annoying and not rank them just because I feel like I can't. Like, I will say whether one is more of a standout than the others or something like that, but I just don't feel like I can pick a favourite at the minute. So sorry if that's a little bit annoying, but yeah, all of these books I really recommend. I will start with some of the like 4.5 star ones though. So these are kind of the lower end of the spectrum. So first off, we've got Any Man by Amber Tamblyn. I absolutely still love this book, but I did give it 4.5 stars just because it has quite a lot of poetry in here and I'm not the biggest fan of poetry, so some of it just didn't sort of resonate with me like the rest of the book did. But honestly, it barely matters. It's just a technicality that it's a 4.5 star. But basically in this book there is an unknown female sexual predator who is targeting men and then violently assaulting them. So it's a very, very heavy book. It's very emotional, very sad, and we're basically following from the perspectives of a few of these different men, but also looking at more of a wider societal lens on some of the issues with this topic. This book was just really fantastic. It's written in a very interesting way where it's a mixture of prose, poetry. I think there was some like podcast transcripts, there were some social media threads. So it's quite easy to get through, but it is emotionally very hard to read because although it's not like overly gratuitous in detail that it goes into, it is still mentioning some of the like horrificness of what these men have been through. So it is hard to get through. It's very upsetting. I was so close to crying at this book and I feel like if I read it again I probably would cry. So yeah, I do recommend this one a lot if it's something that you feel like you can handle at whatever time you want to read it, because yeah, it's a lot. Next up we have The Three-Body Problem by Sascha Ende. This is the first book in a trilogy which I started this year, and I also gave this one a 4.5, but it does feel like a 5-star realistically. This is like a hard epic sci-fi for me. It starts during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but then we're also following this other guy a few decades later who is a scientist, and he basically gets involved with this game called The Three-Body Problem. You don't really know what the purpose of the game is, but it's like a VR situation. It's hard for me to explain what this book is about, but it's very sciencey, but in like a strangely accessible way. Don't get me wrong, it's very like complicated, and a lot of the science that's mentioned in here is like physics related, which for me, physics was always the science subject that just went over my head. I just could not understand it. But the way that they break it down in this book, both the author and I'm assuming the translator, just made it very easy to sort of comprehend for the first time in my life. There's so many big ideas in this book that are just fascinating. For example, it talks about the idea that everything that we've learned about science could potentially not be correct. And I don't want to say too much about what is actually happening because I feel like it's a spoiler, but yeah, this is the start of a trilogy that is involving like a much bigger sort of universal issue. But yeah, it was absolutely fascinating, very mind-blowing, and just made me think a lot about our world and things that we take for granted. So yeah, definitely highly recommend this so far. I think the rest of the books going forward are ones that I have always given 5 stars. So we'll start with The Mustache by Emmanuel Carrère. If you've watched my videos before, especially in the last few months, you will have already heard me talking about this book. But this is basically about a guy who shaves his mustache off one day. He's had a mustache for many years, and his wife basically just doesn't notice or doesn't say anything about it. He starts questioning whether it's him that's the problem or is it his wife, and basically the shaving of his mustache is the catalyst for him just absolutely spiraling. Something about this book was just so engaging and so interesting. I loved how it was written. I just constantly wanted to read it. It's only a very short book, so it's easy to get through. I felt like I really connected with this main character because the way that his sort of thought processes were written out just came across as really relatable, even if some of the things that he was thinking were quite outlandish, and the way that it ends is definitely very memorable and I would definitely recommend it if you like more weird literary kind of books. Next up we've got The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. So this is the second book in the Poppy War trilogy, which I started I think last year. I gave the Poppy War like 4.5 stars, and I feel like this one just gave me everything that I felt I was slightly missing from the Poppy War. Obviously I don't want to say too much about the plot, but the Poppy War trilogy is basically a fantasy series based on Chinese history. So we're following this character called Rin who has special abilities. She goes to this military academy and then basically war happens. So in this book we're following Rin and her companions in the aftermath of the Poppy War, and this one just adds a whole new like depth to the fantasy world that we're reading about. I just love Rin as a character. She's so special. She's very like fiery and impulsive, but I just love that about her. There was always something to keep the plot moving. Like, it's quite a chunky book, but I was never like bored. I never felt like it was slowing down at all. A lot of the like action scenes were very like suspenseful as well. So I just really loved it, and I felt like it ended on the perfect note to sort of start the last book, which I still haven't read yet. I just love when a second book in a series feels even better than the first one, which I feel like is kind of rare. The only time I can remember feeling like this is with The Hunger Games, because The Hunger Games is just unmatched, but Catching Fire was like something otherworldly. And I feel like this one has that same kind of feel for me. So yeah, I just very much enjoyed this one. Next up is more of a slasher horror book, and this is Dead Girl Blues by David Sodergren. So this is my first book by this author, but everything just worked for me perfectly. The writing was so engaging, so like funny as well, but also like equally as messed up and disturbing, and it was just like the perfect kind of almost satirical horror, and I was just obsessed. So I'm pretty sure this book is set in Edinburgh, and we're following this girl who is a dancer in a club, and one day when she's on her way out she stumbles across this girl who has been killed, and her curiosity surrounding this girl's death basically takes her on a journey where she starts uncovering this very messed up underbelly of Edinburgh. And yeah, I just had the most fun reading it. It's definitely very horrifying, very disturbing. It's very gory and graphic, so please be wary of that going into it. The ending of this book kind of destroyed me emotionally, but again, I don't see any other way that it could have ended that it would have had that impact. And I'm just really excited to now read more from this author. I've got loads on my TBR now from him because I feel like his writing just really gelled with what my personal taste in horror is. So yeah, I would highly recommend this if you're into more of like a gory horror. Next up is actually a non-fiction book. This year I have been reading a little bit more non-fiction, and I tend not to rate it, but with this one it just felt like a 5-star, so I've given it a 5-star. This is The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. So this book is essentially a true crime account of one of the most prolific art thieves in the world. His name is Stephen Brettweiser, I think is maybe how you would say it, but he has stolen a ridiculous amount of art in Europe, and this book just basically tells the story of that. It's one of the first true crime stories that I've ever heard that does not include like violence against people, and obviously there's still significant amounts of harm associated with the art theft, but it didn't feel as icky as a lot of true crime tends to feel nowadays. And the way it was written was almost like it was fiction. It had suspense, it had like drama to it, and the art thief himself has actually talked a lot to media and to the author about how he committed these crimes, why he did it, or supposedly why he did it. There's lots of inputs from psychologists who have spoken to him, and there was a ton of research that went behind this book. So it was absolutely fascinating, and I am not like one for being interested in art necessarily, but it did really make me want to go to galleries because it's almost like the art thief's passion for art. You can feel it in this book, but it still does condemn his actions. So it's just very interesting to read. And yeah, like I said, it's written in such an engaging way. It reads like fiction. And it's also very sad as well. Like, to see the trajectory of this guy's life and how he's lived his life was very sad. I highly recommend this one because it was so interesting, and I would never have thought to pick anything like this up. The next one is one of my most recent reads, and this is The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels by Janice Hallett. Janice Hallett is just one of my absolute favourites. Her mystery stories are just unmatched. In this book, we're mainly following this kind of morally grey investigative journalist who writes true crime books. So in this story, the Alperton Angels were a cult back in the 2000s who made headlines because a few of the cult members were found dead, and there was suggestion that they were going to try and sacrifice a baby. 3 people managed to sort of escape this cult, and that was the baby and 2 teenagers. And in the present day, the baby is going to be turning 18 years old. So there's all this renewed attention to the case, and basically our investigative journalist wants to publish a best-selling true crime novel about what happened. So as with all Janice Hallett books, it's mixed media. This is like true mixed media because we have some like audio transcripts, we've got text messages, we've got emails, we've got scripts and stories and all sorts of different things in here. Straight away you can tell that things just aren't adding up, and the way that it all comes together was so complicated and so clever, but perfect. I've seen some people say that it was a little bit like too overly like done, but I just thought, like, how has your brain concocted this? It was so fun to get to the end and just keep reading all these reveals. I feel like the same with The Appeal. Like, you feel like you've just hit this reveal and then there'd be more and then there'd be more, and like the endings of these books are just incredible. Definitely my favourite mystery that I've read this year, possibly one of my favourites that I've ever read, just because I loved how everything came together and I just thought it was exquisitely done. And then my last 3 books are the 3 that I read towards the start of the year. So I have talked about them all quite a few times. I feel like they are kind of my favourites at this point. Like, they might be my top 3 books of the year. But let's just start the kind of top 3 with the one that I have physically. This is A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen Peck. If you've watched my channel at all this year, then you'll have already heard me talking about this book countless times. But this is my favourite novella that I've read this year. This is a horror novella about a guy who has lived a very religious Mormon life, but basically when he dies, he realises that the religion that he was not classed as the true religion. So there's a ton of people that are going to hell, basically. And his version of hell that the devil has picked out for him is this massive library. He basically has to find the story of his life amongst all these books, every book in the universe. And when he finds it, he will be able to ascend to heaven. This book was just everything to me. It's only a short little book. It's 100 and odd pages. I just loved our main character. I loved following his journey. I loved his relationships. I loved seeing the snippets of each kind of society that was forming in this version of hell. He's not alone there. There's other people that have also been given this same like library situation. So it's very interesting to see how people are adapting to this. And I just couldn't help but think about how daunting of a situation that is, how terrifying that is, and how you would actually cope in that situation. And it explores all those different things. I was just in love, obsessed, and yeah, it's definitely one of my favourite like existential human horror stories that I've ever read. I just remembered that the next book I do actually have, so I've just found it behind me. This is Reservoir 13 by John McGregor. I read this one back in January this year and I just fell in love with it. In this book, we're basically following this very small English countryside village. A family have come on holiday in this village and the young girl has gone missing. So in this book, we're basically following the 13 years after this girl's disappearance. So across these 13 years, we're basically looking at little snippets of some of the life that's going on in this village. That includes the people that live there, but also the natural elements of this village. So it almost pays as much attention to like the nature and the surroundings and just the seasons like continuing to move on as much as it does about the people. And that was just so interesting to me. It really just made me rethink my life and appreciate what's going on around me. And the real message in this book is that horrible things happen, but life continues to move on and people do get through it. And I just thought it was such a beautiful message, and yeah, I absolutely loved it. It's not the longest book in the world, but I honestly could have read like a super thick epic novel just about this because it just felt like it could technically never end. There wasn't much of a plot sort of dragging it through. You didn't get to know each character super in depth. It was almost like you just had an overview, but for some reason I just found it super interesting. So if you want something that is literary and just very inspiring, I would definitely recommend this one. And then the last book that I have to talk about, I'm not sure if it's like top favourite, but it's definitely like on a literary sense, an incredible book. It's In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. So this book basically examines a real life relationship that the author has had with another woman, and it was a very sort of abusive and toxic relationship. The way that she's written about it is very creative and very like innovative. It basically splits it into different chapters and looks at it through a different lens. So you're getting like tiny snippets of this relationship, but the way that she has like thought about it and reframed it into lots of different things is so interesting and just very clever. I felt like I highlighted basically 90% of this book because a lot of it was just so moving. It's a very vulnerable book, and I think it's very brave of the author to share her experiences with the world. And it talks a lot about the stigma that she faced being in a relationship with other women and how that almost made her feel like she couldn't speak out about what was happening. And it's the kind of book that it honestly feels like a privilege to be able to read, because it really does feel like she's properly bared her soul in this book. And with that, that is all my top 10 favourite books of this year. And again, I'm sorry that they're not necessarily ranked, but I really did just have such a good time reading this year. So yeah, I really do just love all of them. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books before and what you thought of them. And also let me know what some of your favourite books of the year have been so far. If you are also posting videos, then please do let me know, because I love to look at people's favourites videos at this time of year. So give this video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!